tales for dark nights.
The following performance is a third-round entry in the 2016 Evil Idol voice acting competition, and you, the listener, get to help decide who wins. If you'd like to hear more of this contestant, voting for them is simple and only takes a moment. Just click the thumbs up icon. Can't stand them? Then click the thumbs down icon instead, and cast them into the digital netherrealm from whence they came. You decide their fate. Good luck to all of our contestants.
You don't go out after dark. That had been one of the inn's rules since it opened in the late 19th century. Built on the edge of a wide swath of marshland, it was large, beautiful, and sitting on a precarious edge. During daylight hours, paths were easy enough to see, and enough signposts had been erected that finding one's way to and from Whitemoore House wasn't much of a challenge. After nightfall, however, shadows had a way of obscuring signs and swallowing light. Pathways got tangled and lost underfoot, and one misstep was all it took to end up in one of the bogs. And once you were in, there was almost no getting out. I inherited Whitemoore from my grandfather after he passed away. My mother had been offered the inn, but her life was well established far off in the city, and she couldn't bring herself to leave it behind. She first offered it to my sister, who likewise had too many ties elsewhere, and then to me. I considered turning it down as well, but the thought of Whitemoore being outside of the family for the first time in over a century was an upsetting one. I wrestled with the idea for many days, but after an afternoon of going through old photo albums, seeing how happy everyone had been there, how happy I'd been, I knew what I had to do. It was easier than I'd thought it would be, leaving it all behind. My parents helped me pack my things, and we all made the 4-hour trek north to the distant countryside. The crunch of gravel under my tires as we pulled up to the gates was enough to make the butterflies in my stomach swarm. Memories from my childhood, ones I had not thought about in many years, rushed back to me. Walking hand in hand with my grandparents across the expansive grounds, bordered on all sides by tall stone walls. Racing my sister up and down the grand staircase, our shoes clattering noisily against the dark hardwood. Squishing myself between Mom and the arm of a well-worn but still comfortable chair, so that she could read to me before bedtime. I was sure some of it was skewed by the rosy lens of nostalgia, but I was glad to be back. Grandpa, who believed a job wasn't truly done until it had been overdone, had left behind a thick stack of instructions on how to care for and run the inn. The first few months I was there, I pored over every word he'd written, taking notes, making a few tweaks here and there to modernize the place. The staff, all old hands by the time of my arrival, were generous with their tips and tricks and only too willing to assist me in learning my new role. Between my grandfather's thorough guides and the helpfulness of the employees, I was confident that the Whitemoore would continue to operate successfully, with me at the forefront. That was as long as I kept to the rules. The list was long, but a few of them stuck out. Do not leave the grounds after dark. No one may enter the marsh after sunset. Do not leave the lamps on the exterior garden walls lit after 7 p.m. Lock all 4 gates by 7 p.m. If someone needs to come or go, they can phone the front desk for assistance, but the north gate leading to the marsh trails must remain closed regardless. I had asked the head of housekeeping, Melinda, about the list, and she shrugged. Just how things have to be. Best follow, though, as your granddad said. He knew what he was doing. I learned quickly enough that he had, in fact, known what he was doing, and why the rules were so important. It was a hard lesson, but one I only needed once, and after that single incident, I quickly found my footing as proprietor and grew comfortable in my position. As the years passed, all the inn's quirks and mysteries revealed themselves to me, and it went from being my family's inn to my inn, to my home. Almost 2 decades after I'd taken over, the inn was as successful as it had ever been, and I was still just as happy that I'd returned as I had been on my first day. And then the Baileys showed up. Immediately, I could tell that this family was going to be something of a handful. 7 rambunctious children, 2 overworked, overtired parents, and an elderly grandmother who couldn't be bothered with any of it. I met them as we were checking in, and started with the usual pleasantries. "Yeah, all very well and good. Where's our rooms?" Mr. Bailey, a larger man with a frayed look about him, interrupted me mid-sentence. "Of course," I smiled pleasantly. Too long in the business to little brusqueness get under my skin. "You have 5 rooms, all side by side, on the 3rd floor. Elevators?" "I do apologize, but we only have a service lift, as it says in our brochure. The inn was built before elevators, but if your mother needs assistance, I can have one of the staff take her up in the lift. We do provide a wheelchair." "I'm fine," the old woman said from behind her son. He snorted, swiping the keys from the desktop. "Next you're going to be telling me you've not got any running water." "No worries there, Mr. Bailey," I said cheerfully. "Now, before you go up, I just want to make sure you're aware of some of the inn's rules." "No need, we'll figure it out." He started to gather up his brood and move them to the stairwell. "Well, if you'll just allow me a moment to—" Later. Come on, kids, up you go." I frowned and watched them ascend. The rules were clearly posted in all rooms, but I still liked to go over them personally, especially when I doubted they'd be read. I brushed it off, figuring I'd get them later when they came down for supper, and I went about my business. It was easy to forget about the 10 Bailey bunch with so much else to take care of, and by evening time they'd slipped my mind completely. "Good night, Jonah," I said as I walked through the lobby for my final nightly inspection. "Oh, Miss Hales," Jonah called me back to the desk. "I had a question about the rules." A naturally nervous lad, Jonah had only been working as our overnight reception attendant for a week, and every time he saw me, he had at least one new question. I was glad that he double, sometimes triple, checked with me before he did anything he wasn't certain about, but I did hope he'd gain some independence soon. I smiled, tired but open, and nodded for him to continue. "So what do we do if someone went out on the marsh trails at 6:30 and isn't back yet?" "Excuse me?" I gripped the edge of the desk, praying this was hypothetical. "Well, you know, that family with a lot of kids. They walked through around 6:30, and I heard them saying they were going to go out to the marshes." He trailed off into a strangled silence when he saw that the color had all but drained from my face. I looked at the clock over his shoulder. 8:13. "Why didn't you tell me about this sooner?" I demanded, but I didn't wait for an answer. I dashed from the lobby, moving faster than I had in years, and I ran to my room. Under my bed, I kept a kit, one I had put together and refreshed and renewed every few years, after that incident 2 decades before. I'd been so unprepared then, I hadn't known, but now I did. Equipped with a lantern, flashlights, earplugs, ropes, and flares, I skidded down the steps and through the halls until I spilled out onto the inn's back lawn, the one that faced the marsh. Even as I ran across the grass to the back fence, I knew that it was too late, knew that it had grown too dark. I knew that I wouldn't find them. Still, I dug through my ring of keys until I found the one labeled North Gate. And I broke the rules. I unlocked the gate, and I went out into the darkness. I made sure to shut and lock it securely behind me, and I tied one end of my rope securely to one of the wrought iron bars. The other end I tied around my waist. It was a long rope, the longest I could find, and it would allow me to walk a little way into the marsh without going too deep. It was too dangerous at night to go in any other way. All I could think about the entire time I readied myself, putting in my earplugs, checking my lights, was that one night, 20 years before. I hadn't known. Grandpa hadn't left me anything about it, and no one told me. There had been a wedding that afternoon. It was a beautiful affair, filled with love and happiness, and crowded. Very crowded. No one noticed when the bride's sister, a 12-year-old girl named Hannah, wandered off, bored by the reception. We'd all been so busy that we'd forgotten to close the north gate, much less lock it, and we assumed later that she'd been intrigued by the marsh and its trails. By the time people started looking for her, calling for her, it was after dark. We were all frantic, running about, tearing the place apart. We found her little bouquet of lilies on the path, just beyond that tree line that marked the entrance of the marsh. Cops came, firemen, paramedics, and all of us, save for those who'd worked at the inn for a long time, went in. Searchlights, dogs, radios, footsteps, voices shouting. It was so loud and so bright. She should have been able to find her way back to us. But she never did. They looked for days, and I joined every search party. We combed through the marsh, but there was just no sign of her. Eventually, the heart-wrenching decision was made to give up. It was decided that Hannah had strayed from the path and fallen into a bog, and no one had heard her over the wedding celebration. And that was the end of it. Guilt consumed me, and I found myself trying to ease it with the aid of bottle after bottle of whiskey, until Melinda pulled me aside one day after hours and sat me down in my office with a glass of water and a sigh. "You didn't follow the rules, Miss Hales," she said gently. "I know. I don't think you do." "How could I not?" I snapped back. "I didn't follow the rules, and now some child has lost her life due to my negligence." She shook her head and pulled her chair close to mine. After a quick glance over her shoulder to ensure we were alone, she continued in a low voice. "Your granddad didn't want you or your family to know about this, 'cause he worried it'd make you want to sell the place. He didn't inherit it until after your mom moved out, so she never knew either, but it's time." The marsh, Melinda told me, wasn't an evil place. It was sad. And it was lonely. And that made it dangerous all the same. It had always been easy to lose your way in it, and many a person had paid the ultimate price for their misstep. They're stuck out there, Miss Hales, and they long to be free to be with their families again. It's that longing that keeps them there. Grief and loneliness are powerful drives, and it keeps them searching every night for someone to keep them company. "Ghosts," I said, skeptical even in my half-drunk state. "If that's what you want to call them. After nightfall, they pull themselves from the bog, and they cry out for anyone who can hear to find them and join them. We living never mean to, but it's hard to ignore something that pulls at our hearts so strongly. The pain they feel, the anguish and despair, it pulls us to them. Our empathy is our greatest weakness out there." "You're shitting me. You believe this?" "I believe that there are powerful things in this world, and that hurt is one of them. Do you know what bogs used to be used for?" "Not really." "Graveyards, Miss Hales, and not the kind you go and pay your respects at. They were a dumping ground for bodies, people who'd been sacrificed or murdered. They were where the hopeless would go to end their suffering. Bogs have a long history of death, and ours is no different. Those who pass under such circumstances with such anger or grief burning inside them have a hard time letting go. You think we're sitting on a mass gravesite? Seriously. She narrowed her eyes at my dismissal and stood. Come, let's go for a walk. And so we did, up the dark pathway and to the north gate, where she told me to stand still and listen. At first, all I'd heard was the wind blowing through the marsh, a few night birds, and I felt silly. I almost told her so, but she was clutching the gate and staring out with such intensity that I remained quiet and followed her gaze. That was when I heard it. Somewhere in the distance, barely audible, the sound of a young girl sobbing, calling for help. The more I listened, the more I heard. Moans and voices from somewhere out in the bogs. And part of me wanted to go to them. Why have I never heard this before? I asked, scarcely able to form the words. I had to turn my back to the gate and shake my head to collect myself. It's easy to miss from here when you're so distracted by everything else. Out there, though, when you're alone and away from the inn and light and life, you can't help but hear. But when we were out that night, looking, we didn't see anything. There was so much going on. You were too busy looking to see, too distracted. I'd never gone back outside at night after that, except to lock the gates myself, and since then I'd always made sure to follow the rules. Until the Baileys. With earplugs in place and my rope to guide me home, I inched my way toward the tree line. Beyond it, I knew it would open up into the flat, seemingly endless expanse of the marsh and all its bogs. I could hear the thud of my heart beating against my ribs, feel the chill of fear prickling against the back of my neck. But I pushed myself forward. I started to lose slack on my rope as soon as I'd crossed through the trees, just as I'd intended. I raised the lantern high and narrowed my eyes, searching the gloom for any sign of the large family. There were shapes in the shadows. Some I could write off as overgrown plants and old stumps, but others were different, larger, all too human. They swayed in the windless night, and when my lantern light stretched out towards them, barely brushing the closest one with the edge of its glow, it reached back. And then, slowly, it started to move towards me. Fear rooted me to the spot, although I was screaming at myself to go, run back to the inn. It was getting closer, and with each step I could see it more clearly. Long, dark hair, the dirty remains of some kind of dress, and its skin, leather-like and stretched across its bones. Its thin lips were moving. It was speaking or screaming or crying. I didn't know. The earplugs prevented it. But I knew it wanted me to join it. It was on the path now, just down the way from me, and its hands, with its long skeletal fingers, were grasping at me, beckoning me. Behind it, others had noticed and were starting to crawl and climb from the marsh onto the path. A lumbering giant of what had once been a man, his dark face twisted and flattened by ages spent under the weight of the muck and mire, his skull concave on one side. Another woman, her belly still tellingly large and round beneath the rags that still clung to her, limped towards me. Remnants of decaying rope bound her wrists. A third, a young girl, in the remains of a party dress, 20 years out of fashion, held out her arms to me, as if asking me to pick her up. More were rising behind her. The bog had preserved them, drying their skin, thinning it, darkening it, until they were deflated, sunken versions of their former selves. They moved stiffly, almost painfully, and all of them were coming for me, the only living being in a sea of the dead. They were close enough for me to see their eyes, muddied and yellowed and fixed on me. My light reflected dully off of them. It was those eyes that had me moving, running, tripping, pulling myself along with the rope back to the inn. All of the preparations I'd made to throw flares and use more flashlights and light up the marsh as we'd done the night we looked for Hannah were gone. My only goal was to get back behind the gate and lock myself in. I fell once hard onto my shoulder, and one of my earplugs came loose, and I lost it in the shadows. I could hear them then. Their sadness, their misery, raised in a chorus of choked gurgles and raw wailing. It surrounded me, came from all sides, assaulted me with its desperation. I could feel it clawing at my mind, begging me to turn, to let them have me. There were no words spoken, but I so clearly heard them, 100 voices all filling my head. Join us. Join us. Join us. I strained against it, forcing myself to look ahead at the inn, to focus on the lights still shining from the windows. I thought of Melinda, gone these past few years, of Jonah, who still needed so much help, of my family, who'd given me the gift of Whitemoore and the wonderful life I'd come to lead in it. I thought of my grandfather, and all of his careful, loving instructions passed on so that the place he cared for so much could continue on without him. I slapped a hand over my ear, blocking out the call of the marsh, and I found my feet. I stumbled onward, through the gate, spun and slammed it shut. When the key turned in the lock with a satisfyingly heavy click, I released the breath I hadn't known I'd been holding. I dared to glance back, and in the darkness, I saw yellow pinpricks glaring back at me. I did call the cops the next morning, and they searched the marsh, but the Baileys were not found. Officially, the inn wrote them off as having skipped out without paying. Unofficially, those of us who had been at the inn long enough knew the truth. After that, I kept the north gate locked and refused access to the marsh at any time, regardless of whether it was day or night, and business resumed as usual. Hannah and the Baileys were not spoken of again. I'm getting older now, almost too old to keep running the Whitemoor, and sometimes I think of retiring. On those nights, I go up to the attic, and I sit in the chair I placed up there, and I look out the window, down to the marsh, and I see tiny pinpricks of yellow in the darkness. I am reminded that as long as I am able, I have a duty to the inn, and its staff, and its guests. I am one of the few remaining who still know its history, and what's out there, wandering the marsh. And I stay.
Thank you for listening. If you haven't already, don't forget to cast your vote for this contestant via either a thumbs up or thumbs down vote. By doing so, you'll help us determine who will become the next permanent member of our voice acting team. At the close of voting on September 23rd, based on your votes, the top 5 contestants will progress to the 4th and final round to take place live on October 31st at our annual Halloween live stream event, based entirely on your votes. Thank you for voting and for helping to spread the word. You're listening to Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. I'm Steve Taylor, host of Chilling Tales, the podcast, encouraging you to turn off the lights and turn on the dark.
Chilling Tales for Dark Nights.